Thank you, Chairperson. Thank you, Deputy Minister. Deputy Minister, I'm trying to ascertain with the two meetings that were held with Tony Gupta and Duduzana Zuma.
Honorable Swart,
Yes.
please, my apologies. Can you speak to the mic because you are being recorded and you are far from the mic?
I'm trying to time myself as well carefully, Chair, but thank you for that. Maybe I'll ask my colleague to watch the time. When you had your press conference, you referred to one meeting and you didn't refer to the second meeting. Was that just an omission from your side as far as memory is concerned? Because it's quite significant that there were two distinct meetings with yourself and Mr. Lucky Montana.
With regard to the press engagement, at the press engagement, you'll be asked a question and you'd answer as fully as you think is necessary, relevant to the question that you are asked. So you don't look at all the factors, if I understand you correctly. The answer that I gave on the day I thought was adequate for the question posed.
One does appreciate that when one refers to those meetings, it is a number of years ago, and therefore one's memory might not be very accurate. But when Mr. Lucky Montana, and again one will need to decide on the weight to be attributed to his evidence. We have been criticized for not further cross-examining him yesterday on PROS, and that, as the Chair indicated, was not the function of this inquiry. But one of the issues he does raise, and maybe I can just alert you to that, and that is the issue relating to the first meeting where there was, in your version, a discussion relating to the board prior to the Mr. Gupta and Mr. Zuma arriving. And he's very adamant that you had tea. He said, we had a conversation and you had a tea party then, I presume. You had tea. We were joined 30 minutes later by the two gentlemen, and he says it specifically on page 53. The Deputy Minister claimed in his media briefing that we had met to discuss the board of PROSA. This is not true. On your version, you say that you had met to discuss the board of PROSA. Is that still your version? Because obviously we've got contradicting versions now on the first meeting.
In regard to the first meeting, from what I recall, the issue of PRASA was raised, and the issue of engagement with Tony Gupta was also raised.
You indicate that the issue of the PRASA board was discussed before the arrival.
Yes, in my engagement with Mr. Montana, okay. That was discussed with him.
And Mr. Montana takes a strong view. He says this is not true. His version is, I had no business to discuss the appointment of the board of PRASA with the Guptas. The minister had introduced them to me and informed me that they were expressed an interest in the PRASA rolling stock fleet renewal program. So I appreciate that there's a difference of opinion as to what was said there, and we're not going to take that any further. You say in that first meeting, at the time there was talk and rumors, and you go on. So your whole version on page 32.1 of your statement is that the whole discussion at the first meeting related to the PRASA board and the possibility of him being removed. That they were going to, and that seems to be more consistent with a latter event. And one appreciates that time has lapsed, that latter, when the letter was sent to you and there was concerns about the board meeting. So one might have a lapse in memory. Do you think that's possible from your side?
I think that's a possibility. As I said, I've not had the opportunity to go to records. I've not looked at files. And even in the meetings that I had with Mr. Montana to discuss the issues of the allegation that there was pressure for them to be removed from their positions, I didn't take notes of those meetings, so I can't say that I've got a record.
And that
there,
would
you
be a reasonable explanation, given the time lapse and that, and it would be more consistent with Mr. Montana's version of him meeting. The issue of the tender, this multi-billion rand tender, is discussed. He goes to Berlin. He then is shocked about the news of Berlin, where people are, you refer to it as a misrepresentation, which is a ground of fraud, that he says here the Guptas were extorting money from manufacturers and had wanted this money to be paid into an account in Dubai. And then they were apparently summoned, the manufacturers, to a meeting in Zurich with Salem Essa. You wouldn't have knowledge of that, but it was at this meeting they were instructed to pay monies as they wanted to get a share of the PRASA new build program. I was so furious at this and saw this as extortion. Then he comes back, and that's the second meeting then that takes place. He called you and requested you to convene a meeting with Mr. Dudizana Zuma and Mr. Tony Gupta. He went to your house. They were there, and the third gentleman, you gave the name. And then he spoke at length at this meeting, and you both condemned the conduct there. Now, what is very interesting here is Mr. Montana says they were arrogant and reminded Mr. Martins, that's yourself, that they did not want me, that's him. But you had convinced them that he was your comrade. After an hour of fighting, do you remember that part at all of the meeting? Again, bearing in mind it took a long time, and it was, you agree that it would be it was an acrimonious meeting?
All I know is that it was an acrimonious meeting.
I appreciate
Yes.
time lapse. So you may have forgotten that that actually did occur. Would you agree with that? That's possible.
That's possible.
So he says, after an hour of fighting, they ultimately relented, but after they had accused me, that's Mr. Lucky Montana, of favoring Bombardier over other companies, I rejected the accusation very strongly. You say the meeting, I think you used the word acrimonious somewhere, did you? And that brought the discussion to an end. So it's quite possible that Mr. Montana is correct in his version. It was an acrimonious meeting. You might not recall specifically that the Guptas were, or Mr. Gupta was upset, and he said, but you know, we didn't want Mr. Lucky Montana. We didn't want him, and we warned you about him. You might not remember that having been said, although that's quite a severe statement. You would surely remember that.
It's quite a severe statement. I don't recall it being said in my presence in that meeting.
You see, Deputy Minister, if one looks at the picture of what one sees with state capture, you see a pattern developing of certain people, certain CEOs, ministers taking positions, and then when they are not compliant, they've been moved out of the way. And it seems, as I say, we haven't, I want to categorize this because I've also been criticized in the media, we haven't interrogated PRASA and the whole issue around that. So I'm not commenting on the character of Mr. Montana. At this stage, there's nothing to disbelieve him on this meeting. But it does seem to play into the narrative of ministers being deployed, that you did meet the Guptas at their home, and there was this meeting, and whilst you don't have a correct reflection of everything, there doesn't seem at this stage to be much to disbelieve Mr. Lucky Montana on the pressure that was brought to bear upon him. Would you tend to agree with that? Yes. And that's fair enough, because as I say, it's a long time ago. And it does play into, because again, when people are not cooperative, then the next step would be to remove them from the board. And that is where the second element came into the removal from the board and the strong letters, and that's where you said the board will not be moved. They're in the middle of this project, the PRASA tender, and you took a very strong standpoint, commendably. Would you agree that there is a pattern already developing at that early stage, although you wouldn't have known it? With hindsight now, you can see a pattern developing of board members being removed, to satisfy a certain agenda. Secondly, yourself, when you did not comply with a favor, weren't you soon thereafter, a month later, removed from Minister of Transport to Minister of Energy?
Well, it is correct that a month after that I was removed from transport and made Minister of Energy.
So what I said yesterday to Mr. Montana is, had we, and again, Parliament has a certain oversight role, we might have also erred, but had we all been more focused on being more aware, we would not be in the situation, possibly speculating, today that we're sitting with Eskom and other SOEs. Would you think in hindsight that that would be a fair observation?
I think if we analyze and look at all these issues with the benefit of hindsight, we would be able to see certain trends. Other postulates might be confirmed, other postulates might not be confirmed.
Correct.
But as
Yeah,
you
sorry.
correctly say, that there's nobody that I know of at this stage who have sat and looked at the trajectory and the phenomena that you have highlighted here.
Correct. And,
So, and
sorry.
that will be necessary to be done.
I think there has been quite a bit of research from here, but I think you correctly say at that stage you had nothing, the family were not that well known, so you had nothing to respond to. But let us just get quickly, I see my time is very limited. What I don't understand, and I've known you for many years, I can't explain, because Ms. Daniels presented her evidence and there's a total denial from you with backing up evidence that you weren't there. Is it possible that she confused the date? But that probably could not happen because you denied totally any meeting with her.
With regard to Ms. Suzanne Daniels, I've had meetings with her. We should recall that she is the company secretary of Eskom. She is also holding the position of the legal advisor of Eskom. So in the remit of her responsibilities, there is interaction between the board members of Eskom, the chair of Eskom, and the previous chair of Eskom. She advised very closely. This is Dr. Ben Ngubani. And when there were issues around the matter concerning the payments due or not to Mr. Brian Molefe, we had occasion for the two legal teams of Eskom and the department to discuss and get clarity on the legal matters concerning Mr. Brian Molefe. So in that context, I did meet her.
What is your relationship with Ms. Daniels, would you say? Your working relationship with Ms. Daniels?
My working relationship with her is fine. It's a person that I've only met in the context of the responsibilities that I assumed. I don't know her at a personal level. I don't have any reason to have a grudge or something against her. But in the context of the ministerial engagements with Eskom and her role, the two roles that she had there, we spoke. And some of the conversations in regard to trying to advise the minister, obviously when you have two legal teams and they differ there, we'd be able to come in and try and mediate.
I've got 20 seconds left.
Yes.
I just wanted to ask you, sorry, Deputy Minister, but she alleges that that whole meeting related to that specific Molefe issue, and you said in your press statement, you said as head of legal, firstly, you admit to admonishing her in the past, and secondly, you called her a clueless ignoramus. Do you still hold to that view, that she's a clueless ignoramus?
I think in regard to the first portion of what you stated in regard to her responsibilities, in the meetings that we held with the chairperson and the minister, and in regard to some of the decisions that she had taken as company secretary and legal advisor to Eskom, I differed and pointed out certain things there. In regard to the issue of ignoramus,
Clueless ignoramus.
yeah, clueless ignoramus,
Yeah.
you have to read that sentence in context.
Can I read it
The
to you?
entire
I think-
sentence and what precedes it.
Sure. You said,
Yes.
as the head of legal, Ms. Daniels should account to Parliament for what happened under her watch, rather than seek to use the occasion to reinvent herself as a clueless ignoramus. Do you think
correct.
that's what she did in her evidence here?
I believe that there are issues that she could better attest to and give clarity on. One of the issues from the top of my head, I think in May sometime, she came to the portfolio committee as the head of legal, as the company secretary. And the Brian Mulife issue was discussed here in regard to payments. And there's a version of events that she gave to the portfolio committee. Later on, when she comes, her testimony contradicts what she had said here.
I understand that, and just as much as we might on the probabilities differ, but it's
Yes.
a very strong term from a, and it's not normally knowing you as a person, language that you would use normally, and it seems, but one does understand, but it's a very strong indictment. But Chair, that's the end of my time and my questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Honorable Swart.